Hello everyone, welcome to the Diplomacy course. Today we will continue with Chapter 4, Ottoman Diplomacy and Diplomatic Letters. We will start this chapter by talking about ad hoc Ottoman diplomacy. Then we will continue with permanent Ottoman diplomacy and Ottoman heritage in the Republican diplomacy. Let's start with ad hoc Ottoman diplomacy. Diplomacy can be broadly defined as an instrument of solving problems between the states before going into an armed conflict. However, it's not limited to the solution of interstate problems in peace. Although diplomacy aimed to solve interstate problems throughout history, its instruments and institutions transformed. In its primitive form, states were sending diplomats or missionaries temporarily to fulfill specific duties, which was called ad hoc diplomacy. As one of the long-lasting empires of world history, the Ottoman Empire conducted its foreign relations via ad hoc diplomacy until the end of the 18th century. It was one of the dominant powers until the end of the 17th century and carried out its diplomatic relations on the basis of superior-inferior dichotomy. Born as a small tribe in the neighborhood of the Byzantine Empire at the end of the 13th century, the Ottoman state turned into one of the greatest empires in world history. They owe much to their geographical position, administrative, economic, and military systems for this success. Although it was an expansionist power with imperial claims, the Ottoman Empire did not neglect diplomacy in the period between 15th and 18th centuries and conducted diplomatic relations with many countries. The main objective of the Ottoman rulers through conducting these pragmatic relations with foreign states was to be an influential actor in the European system. The sultans carried out cautious diplomatic relations with the European states considering balance of power in the European state system. From the 18th century onwards, the power pendulum began to move from the Ottomans to the European states, and diplomacy became more important for the Ottomans than warfare. However, the Ottoman Empire waited for about a century to adopt the institutions and instruments of modern diplomacy and to replace their ad hoc diplomacy. Institutionally, Ottoman sultans were sending agents or envoys to carry out their specific missions in the ad hoc diplomacy period. Although they did not establish permanent embassies in foreign states before the 18th century, the Ottomans allowed foreign states to establish diplomatic missions in the empire. Let's move on to the permanent Ottoman diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire had to adapt the instruments and institutions of modern diplomacy at the end of the 18th century. Dynamics shaping Ottoman diplomacy were totally different from ad hoc period up until 1790s, and instruments and institutions of Ottoman diplomacy were compatible with these dynamics. The French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution had serious impact on the Ottoman Empire. Ideas of nationalism, nation-state, equality, fraternity, liberty, and justice born out of the French Revolution accelerated the collapse of the empire as other multi-ethnic and multi-religious empires. Starting from the Balkans, all minorities in the Ottoman Empire came up with the demands for independence or at least equality among communities. In 1839, Tanzimat Edicts and in 1856, Islahat Edicts were declared to grant some rights and privileges to the foreign subjects of the empire. The diplomats believed that the empire could be saved through West-oriented reforms and modernization. Ottoman modernization process started with the military as early as Selim III. Therefore, the first Ottoman embassy was established in London in 1793, and this was a turning point in Ottoman diplomacy. In the late Ottoman period, modernization of diplomatic service was followed by the professionalization of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With the modernization of diplomatic instruments and institutions, the Ottoman Empire benefited from the rivalry among European powers. During the Tanzimat era, allies of the empire were the Great Britain and France, but with the reign of Abdülhamid II, Germany became the major ally. Despite the alliances between the Ottoman Empire and these states, they were all seeking to maximize their political, economic, and military interests. In this vein, the scope of capitulations was extended and certain privileges were granted to all these European powers. Our last topic for today is Ottoman heritage in the Republican diplomacy. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic was established by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. When the national struggle ended, Turkey was a politically, economically, militarily, and socially backward country. Starting from the early 1920s, Atatürk carried out reforms in various areas. From the political system to the alphabet, the impact of reforms dispersed throughout the country. The major goal was to consolidate the newly established nation-state and cut the ties with the Ottoman Empire to the extent possible. However, with regard to foreign policy and diplomacy, there are certain commonalities between the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. Firstly, the Turkish Republic was established on the same geography despite shrinkage of Ottoman territories after the 18th century. The straits and geographical location as a bridge between Europe and Asia of the Turkish Republic can be considered as important elements of its foreign policy. Secondly, the mindset of the Republican rulers and diplomats have been shaped by the Ottoman balance of power strategy, especially after the 19th century. Both its founders, Atatürk and İnönü, and their successors tried hard to increase the number of friends and decrease the number of enemies. The global conjuncture and Turkey's own interests like protection of territorial integrity and sovereignty, economic development, and military modernization necessitated to do so. Thirdly, rulers of the Turkish Republic, similar to the Ottoman sultans and the statesmen, especially during the decline and collapse periods, have refrained from wars and they have attached great importance to the solution of problems through diplomacy. In this vein, Turkey became a member of League of Nations in 1932 upon its invitation and joined the United Nations after World War II and NATO in 1952. So, this is the end of our program for Chapter 4 of the Diplomacy course. Goodbye and see you in our next program, Chapter 5.